of money, and you said the basic fee is 50 quid, and we're going to give you 100 quid, and we'll buy out all the world rights for secondary market. Now, they weren't as significant then as they are now. Now, in ITV and BBC, the unions were strong enough to negotiate royalties and residuals so that, you know, each time the show played in Latvia, you got 5 quid or whatever it was. I mean, I still get money for scripts I wrote the early days of television, and it's hardly worth writing out the cheque, you know, because if you get 2.5% of 25 quid or whatever it was, you know, it's just about 55p or something. Now, again, all very cost effective. So Euston Films was based in a derelict school in Hammersmith in West London. Now this gave us some offices. We had storage rooms, we rigged cutting rooms, and if we needed, there was room in the classrooms and things to build sets and so on. All I had to do was send the art department property buyer out with 50 quid to get some second-hand furniture, and we were off in a hack. There are other advantages of the system at all. You need the technicians you cast rather like the actors. You've got people who are good and wanted to do it instead of in the studio. The guy who was rostered this week and would sooner be on his allotment, you know. Now again, this was all advantage to the studio because to Thames, because they could now, instead of having to make lots of expensive drama with all the gizmos that went with that, they could have 3 old ladies talking about origami, you know, in the same studio, and it was much cheaper. Whilst we were on the road making drama for probably 25–30% cheaper than they could do it in the studio. We were left very much on our own there, which was great. You know, I was fairly new, and there I was in this derelict school with a group of boys and girls who were enjoying it very much. I think we were partly left alone because the parent company didn't want the union arrangements in-house upset when they found out how we were actually working. And in fact, Euston Films was to serve as a catalyst in a major sort of revolution in the television and film unions, but that's another story. As I say, it was a tight schedule. We had to make a 52-minute episode every 10 working days. And that meant everybody worked quite hard. You know, we often did 14-hour days. Well, the overtime was very good, and that was clearly attractive. I think those of us who survived with great affection. Tom Clegg, I mentioned earlier, he directed the last episode of Special Branch I produced, and the pilot film for the Sweeney, Regan. And we'd cast Dennis Waterman to play a part in this last Special Branch episode, and Tom and I both thought he'd be a good sidekick. You know, he fitted the bill, sort of cutting at you. And then we cast an actor called Garfield Morgan to play Regan's boss, Detective Chief Inspector Haskins. Now, the idea was that he was an honest and boring bureaucrat committed to the new order that was being established in the Metropolitan Police, and of course, as a result, a real pain in the bum as far as Regan was concerned. We had other regular actors who played junior officers reporting to Regan, and we had obviously names of guest principals who came in to play villains or lawyers or whatever it was. Now, the most challenging task was finding time in this very tight schedule to shoot action, because we had to shoot an average of 5 minutes edited screen time a day to make a 52-minute episode. I mean, it'd be shorter now, but that was a television hour in ITV because you had to allow for commercials and promotions and things. A major stunt like one of those car crashes you saw would take at least a day to film, and at the end of it we'd be lucky if we had a minute's edited screen time. So we had to find a way of building up the time in other ways. We needed weather cover. We were shooting in London, very often in the winter, and when the monsoons came, you know, you couldn't all be trudging around in the rain, even if you had your Mac on. So we killed 2 birds with 1 stone, because there was a school hall part of this derelict premises we were in, and we built their sort of representation of the flying squad offices, the suite of offices they had. I forget what floor it was, but in the Scotland Yard building in Victoria Street, Westminster. And writers were asked to set at least 10 minutes of any episode they wrote in these offices. So we had a week's weather cover, a day's weather cover a week, and also because it was always fairly straightforward in these sets, we established lighting positions and camera positions. Now, of course, this annoyed a lot of directors, but you know, if it was Regan on the phone saying, "Where's Haskins?" You know, you didn't want to spend the morning with a director doing a lot of this, you know, because you knew what would happen. It would be a close-up in the end. So now, having established that, we could shoot 10 minutes a day in those scenes, and that meant that we had the time to do action stuff, which clearly took a lot more time. Now, I prepared a format document, printed with the writers, setting out all this, and I brought some copies today. You don't have to read now, but anyone who's interested, can I pass those around? Anyone who's interested might have a look at that. Now, Ian Kennedy Martin, who I spoke about, he developed some good relationships with active members of the flying squad, and we built on these. I mean, we had hoped, as you always hope, that you're not going to get any interference from the police, but somebody must have tipped them off, and Ian and I, this was before we started shooting, Ian and I were summoned to Scotland Yard to meet the celebrated Detective Chief Superintendent Jack Slipper. Now, he was a bit of a legend in his own lunchtime. He was the sleuth who didn't bring Ronnie Biggs, the train robber, back from Brazil, but he'd been a leading figure in the flying squad, and I think, you know, he was flanked by a couple of PR guys, but his job was to find out what we were about. Anyway, the upshot of it was that they wanted an official advisor appointed to the series to look after their interests. Now, we could have said no, but, you know, all the time you're looking for police permissions to film and all the rest of it, and we reluctantly said okay. But we kept our surreptitious connection with lots of squad officers we knew and bought drinks for, and a great deal of story ideas came from them, you know, because they knew what they were doing, and a lot of them were, as I say, quite funny and clever, and the way they described their work, and I used to get writers to go out drinking with them, and you know, that paid off. Now, I think, to be fair, the Metropolitan Police's concerns were understandable. They weren't receiving a good press at that time, and there were lots of concerns about the way the flying squad worked. I mean, in those days there was little phone tapping, there was no widespread use of CCTV, there was no real electronic surveillance or IT analysis, and the Met didn't even have a proper intelligence gathering organisation. And given that it was the role of these detectives to prevent as well as detect crime, and they used to have to put themselves about, as they used to say, mixing with the criminal fraternity to try and find out what was going on by way of bank blags and armoured security truck hoists and the various crimes they were charged with trying to prevent or even detect after they'd happened. Now, to do that, they had to ingratiate themselves with a lot of villains. I mean, the good Sweeney officers had their snouts. These were informers, and they were bribed, bullied or blackmailed into giving information about what might be happening, what crimes, you know, bank raids and so on were being planned. Now, this kind of working environment, it always gives grounds for moral concerns. I mean, the temptations placed before not particularly well played junior officers, it could be great. And I always worried a bit, you know, if we went out, maybe barbecue at some detective inspector's house, and sometimes, you know, we, and particularly the actors, were invited to these sort of events. You see this rather nice swimming pool, and you think, hang on, he's only on about 20 grand a year. And it was always that question about, you know, are they on the take? And I think some of them were. I mean, the other big racket was the straw man. Insurance companies paid, I suppose they still do, they paid a reward if a major robbery, say an armoured truck or whatever, was prevented. What very often happened was a snout would come to one of the flying squad officers and say, I know this is going off and I want the reward. And of course what they used to say, well, we'll nick you for something else. You put in for the reward, you keep 20 quid and you give you the rest of it to us. Now, I was told that went on. I know firsthand. Now, we were constrained by the guidelines. Now, these still exist. These were instructions on standards and practices published by the then regulatory body, which is no Ofcom, and then it was the IBA, the Independent Broadcasting Authority, who worked this out in consultation with the Home Office. Now, there was no Department of Media and the Arts in those days. It was all done through the Home Office. Now, mainly these referred to sex, violence, bad language and such. But there was a kind of implied requirement that you didn't misrepresent somebody holding public office, like a policeman. And now, we did push the envelope as far as we could. We never depicted our principals as corrupt, although we might show them bending the rules. But we did portray other bent police officers, usually with the notion that they get found out during the piece. Crime doesn't pay, etc., etc. We also tried to show the stresses and strains that working in this kind of police work imposed on the practitioners, because dramatically it was quite interesting. They worked long hours. There was very much a drinking culture, a lot of marital strain, and sometimes breakup was common. I remember talking to a young cop in a pub, and I said, "Oh, I thought you went off duty an hour ago," and he was in the pub with the rest of the boys, and he said, "No, something might come off." And that means that he might be in on a raid, he'd do well there, and of course that would go on his AQR, and they'd put him a little nearer in the frame to get promoted to sergeant. And this created a lot of personal pressure, and we tried to depict this on occasions. Can you roll the next bit? Well done. This is a guy, one of the young cops working for Regan.
I'm looking for DS Gallagher. Detective Sergeant Gallagher's on sick leave.
Sorry?
Any other human beings in the building?
Sorry.
No.
What are you doing here?
I live here, remember?
Let me just.
Yes. I was just trying to clean up.
You don't seem to be doing too well.
Well, it was late this officer, you see.
Oh, George, you are the limit. Mummy gave me this when I first went away to college.
I didn't do it on purpose, love.
But you're a sight more careful down at the yard.
I'm sorry. How was your day?